Good evening, good morning, and hello, wherever you are in the world. Hopefully everything is working my side, and you've got audio and picture, and we'll start. That was a show reel, just to sort of introduce myself and my company. My name is James Tonkin. I'm a director, a cinematographer, and a colorist, and I've made films for bands and various brands for the last 20 years. And I run a production and post-production company here called Hangman in the UK. Very occasionally I get a chance to present at shows and sometimes special events like these. And I'm always really interested to kind of highlight, to use these opportunities to talk about the combination of new tools and things that we get to use and put into practice. In this case, lenses, and lenses from a company called Laowa. And these really help to inspire and create the kind of films that we make. So my ethos has always been to really embrace new technology, both in production and also in post-production, as I find it really moves our craft forwards. So that's kind of a nutshell about why I'm doing this. And before we just kind of get into what we're going to talk about, I should say, as just an order of business, this is a Laowa event, and they've been very kind and kind of asking me to do this. So one thing they said was that there is a 5% sort of discount code that can be used throughout this event. I think it's exclusive to this event, but if you basically want to buy anything from Laowa, use this code, and it's available for any items basically on their website. So moving on, what I want to talk about tonight, or this morning, or wherever you are in the world, is macro cinematography. And this is something that I got inspired by years and years ago when I first watched Blue Velvet, actually. I'm just going to pull up a clip of Blue Velvet just as we talk so I can show you the intro. I'm going to play, because we're talking about cinematography, I'm going to play a lot of clips, basically. So, this is the intro of Blue Velvet, and what inspired me so much was this incredible tracking shot which takes you inside the grass and inside the world, basically, and see all the insects and the bugs, and this really kind of stuck in my head. I thought, how to do this, so interesting. And then there's been various other cases in cinema where macro photography has really also inspired me. There's this incredible sequence from Panic Room, which I'll play now as well, and this is more to highlight that often, because macro photography or cinematography is actually very complicated to do, especially on set. In this case, everything was really created in CG. But there's this one moment, I remember watching this in the cinema, which absolutely blew my mind. It's a sequence you're going to see in a second. Sorry about the very low quality rip of this. There's a sequence coming up where the camera, apart from the fact this is incredible seamless camera move, it goes right inside the keyhole. And that, as I know now, is all CG. And in many cases, macro cinematography in cinema is created entirely in CG because it's something that you can control so much better, basically, in terms of the ease and the control of the camera, and you really have kind of obviously unlimited creativity when it comes to CG. But it's the sort of elements like this where you're just tracking so close to things. Watching this now really reminds me of a lot of the work I've seen people do with the Laowa probe lens, because that lens is so incredible that you can go so close to things. Anyway, so all of these things really kind of stuck in my head, And what we're going to talk about tonight is some practical applications, a film that I made last year, using basically all around the aesthetic of macro cinematography. But before we look at that, we'll also do a little bit of a live kind of demo, looking at some macro, actual kind of live macro cinematography here in the studio. But before we get into that, there's a project that I worked on about 10 or almost 11 years ago now, and that's really what got me sort of started in first filming something with macro. And what I'll do is I'll pull up the project and I'll start playing it, and then I'll probably talk over the rest of it. So I got hired to go to Beijing, and basically I was commissioned to make some films for an auction company over there. So if I'll just play you the intro and then start playing, and I'll start talking over some of the rest of it. I just thought I'd actually let that play. I haven't watched that for a while, and I really like the music. So just to give a bit more information about that film, so I got the chance to go to Beijing, and I was asked to basically photograph these really expensive multi-million-dollar watches and diamonds. And because these watches have so many incredible complications, I started reading up a lot about all of the techniques, and that, you know, they're all completely mechanical. They're incredible little devices. It seems so appropriate that we wanted to be really inside the watch and inside the footage, basically. So that's why I decided, you know, this was ultimately a project that had to all be shot with macro photography. It was the only way to kind of do it justice. So I bought a lens. Basically, this was 2011. No, 2010 was the first time I went across. A few things actually I learned very early on, and I'll just kind of cut to the footage as we talk about it. You can see some of my obsessions, obviously, of the David Lynch stuff there, and also because I just, you know, this whole intro sequence, we wanted to create something quite ethereal and abstract. And I also learned quite early on that doing this sort of macro style photography on people was exceedingly tricky, basically, because the human skin, as beautiful as it might look in a portrait, suddenly you put it under an ultra macro lens and it looks very different. But anyway, that's kind of beside the point. So these watches you can see here, looking through the footage, I mean, they have absolutely incredible complications, so much going on inside. And you only really see all these details under an extreme ultra macro lens. In this case, I was using a Canon 𝘼𝙗𝙬𝙅 and a 100mm Canon macro lens as well. And the 𝘼𝙗𝙬𝙅 is a magnifying lens, much like the Laowa 25mm lens, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. And why this is so interesting is that you could, I mean, these serial numbers on these watches are absolutely, I mean, they're almost unreadable to the human eye. So to be able to film all these complications inside these watches, all this sort of, these details, really to me was, I mean, you can see the kind of a scale of the watch there, and you can see how small all these little things are, and they're all ticking away, doing their incredible kind of little things inside. So I was really inspired working on this project. And also I was so inspired, just to give a bit of background, because I was commissioned, it's a very low budget project, a bit of a backpack project in a way. And I just got myself on an economy flight to Beijing, took everything, all my, you know, at the time, this was back in 2010, 11, so I was filming with a Canon 7D. I took a little portable slider with me. I had which is how I was doing those slider shots on the table, basically just sliding in along the table to the watches like that. And also a tiny little light and a small HD monitor, the very first small HD monitor, I think a DP6. And I took it all kind of literally in my hand luggage and got off the plane, got myself into a taxi, went straight to the company and I was filming this within an hour of landing, basically, within an hour of being there in Beijing. And what was inspiring is that, I mean, really, you can probably see the reflection there. You can see also, you see the reflection of my little LED light panel. You can see that this is just literally a hand panel, because what we're filming is so small. You don't need a big volume of light. You just need quite a high intensity of light a lot of the time, because you're filming at very deep f-stops. And we'll talk about that a little bit later, and actually demo that here in the studio. So the environment to set this up and do this was literally just a corner office, and I guess got really inspired by doing this. And then typically I'd bought this macro lens and then I didn't touch it for 8 years, as is often the way. I mean, the 100mm macro lens I use a lot, but this specific Canon Ep.5 because of its magnification. It was such a specialist lens, it wasn't really appropriate for me to kind of use on 95% of projects. So it got eBayed in the end, and yeah, I was just always thinking, there must be a great project at some point where I'm going to get a chance to revisit and make something like this. So after that, I didn't do any macro kind of work for a long, long time. And then last summer, I got invited by Atomos and Zcam to test ProRes RAW recording on the Zcam E2 F6. And this is recording via Atomos Ninja 5. And I'm using the Zcams a lot in projects, and the Zcam E2 F6, particularly fond of as a camera because it's a full frame camera, full frame sensor, 6K recording. And to have ProRes RAW on that camera I thought would be really interesting. And it was also ProRes RAW as a codec that I hadn't used on a project yet, so I was really interested to test it out. And I wanted to test it from a point of view of its dynamic range, because of being a RAW codec, and I like to really push and pull and stretch the image in post a lot. The resolution as well, because it would allow me to record at full 6K. And also the HDR workflow, because I was using it inside of Final Cut 10, and I was just really keen to test HDR with ProRes RAW and see how straightforward that workflow would be. So also last summer, we were in a lockdown, so we're quite restricted in what we could film and do at the time. In fact, I hadn't done any production work since March. So I was thinking about an idea that I could contain, and something that I could really just sort of work on in a very kind of low-key way without much help, and just essentially a kind of a little bit of a creative science labby type project, and something I could film with this codec and this camera. And that's what hit me upon the idea of macro again, because at this point I didn't actually have a magnifying lens anymore. So I reached out to Laowa, and they supported this film, and they've supported by sending the 25mm Laowa ultra macro, and it's such an interesting lens, as we'll look at shortly, because it's a 2.5 to 5 times magnification lens. So it's quite incredible what you can see with this lens. It's like looking through a microscope. And I thought this would be really interesting. And I also got a chance to use Laowa's 100mm macro lens, which is a focal length I'm much more familiar with, having also used the Canon 100mm lens a lot. But something really nice about the 100mm Laowa macro lens is that it just allowed me to use it as a bit of a portrait lens as well. So it's a much more sort of flexible lens, and it basically armed with a combination of both lenses. I started thinking of kind of creative ideas and things that I could come up with to film. One of them, well, if I kind of broke it down in my head, I thought, you can't make a macro-based film without filming an eye. Basically, it's just something that's so it's like a portal into a world, the eye. So I thought I would open with an eye, and then also I would create basically a combination of different sort of like science lab, homebrew, kind of combination of things which I could film that would look really interesting in ultra macro detail. Some of them being ideas that I've been inspired by watching other photographers and other cinematographers. I started doing a bit of kind of internet research. I was really inspired by a film that Roman Hill had made. He's definitely worth searching for on Vimeo or YouTube. He made an incredible film which kind of showed this kind of alchemy of all of these chemical reactions, and it just sort of transported me when I watched it, and I found the imagery so inspiring and beautiful. And also, I was looking at lots of photographers, and Stuart Wood, who has also been on this series. I found his work really inspirational, especially his work with water droplets and the sort of bokeh and refractions and reflections he was doing. And also, he's a very giving photographer and filmmaker, and sharing a lot of his techniques. So I just watched lots of videos, and I watched lots of kind of ideas of how I could kind of make up different solutions and things that I could film. So armed with this, I basically started to put together a bit of a kind of a shot list of what I'd create, and really I just made about 6 different setups: macro eye, kind of at an opening, then oil, metallics, food dyes, solutions, dropping aspirin into the solutions, anything I could do to create a sort of an alchemy of reactions and film that at kind of macro detail. Then some water droplet kind of bokeh, kind of inspired ideas, inspired by Stuart's work. Also filmed us, I thought for a dynamic range it'd be good to film a sparkler and some smoke particles. And then at the end, as you'll see, sort of decided to film some flowers again, but with a bit of a twist to the ending. So I'll play that film, and then I'm going to play it in full again. I've got a BTS behind it, which I'll also talk about, and then kind of break it down a little bit more that way. So this is a film called Unseen. So that was quite a fun experiment of kind of homebrew, cooked up little sort of science labby type ideas, and also probably the most kind of creative thing I've done for quite a while, because a lot of my work is creating films for bands, so I don't normally get to mix up paints and oils and film them at 5 times magnification. To kind of break up the film a little more and kind of to talk about it, I'm going to play a BTS in the background, and this time I'm just going to sort of talk over it as we see it playing. So this is me in post, sort of putting it together inside a Final Cut, and quite a lot of, I've actually got some rushes that I'll show in a little bit as well, to sort of show the process of what I captured in the camera. And it was very straightforward in a way in terms of image workflow. I thought we'd do a little test first, just shoot some stuff, put it straight into the computer. Because for me, it's really about half creating the image in camera and then finishing it in post. That's sort of my ethos. I'm just going to also look at some questions that we asked at the same time. There's a good question here. The hard time picking where to focus when doing this kind of abstract shot and macro. That's a really good point. We'll kind of look at that in a minute when I actually do a bit of a live sort of demo. What I tend to do, and in this case, I really just prepared these elements, specifically like the oil and paint, the metallics, the food dyes, the solutions. Sort of prepared each one, and then just shot quite a lot of footage, to be honest. And I remember shooting for about an hour and feeling like I didn't really get anything interesting. And it wasn't until we kind of like messed around with the combinations of how to kind of like create these little kind of alchemies. And there you can see that sort of solution with aspirin, just creating bubbles. And it took a while before we found something kind of interesting. And also it took a while, because it's not something I do all the time, just to try and figure it out and to get it right as well. So that's why I'm sort of keen to share some of these ideas and tips now, because it was a sort of a bit of a sciencey kind of experiment, just to see what was going to actually work in front of the lens. And as I'll demonstrate, there's a lot of technically difficult things when you're filming at such intense magnification. But in terms of the image themselves, that's the 100mm on the eye there. It's such a great lens for that. And you can see just sort of manipulating a lot of the images there, all shot, as I say, in 6K, with some of the exception of the slow motion, which was actually shot at 4K. And why I found shooting with a RAW codec so useful was that it really allowed me to push and pull the images extremely, as you would with photography, basically. So, to shoot things, 3 or 4 stops under in some cases, as you'll see in some of the rushes. But then to be able to rescue them later, because when you're shooting RAW, you're shooting with without the constraints of ISO, so you can shift your ISO around afterwards, and as long as you've essentially, you can completely play with your colors as well. And I didn't really know what I was going to do, other than that I wanted to kind of experiment with deep saturations. And there's an HDR version of this film on YouTube as well, which, if you have HDR, if an HDR TV is sort of set up, I think it's really worth watching. The flames there, I mastered them at 1000 nits, and they are really bright. Certainly when I watch them next door, my XDR displays, they're really, really bright. So what I'll do is I'm actually going to pull up some rushes. I'm going to keep keeping an eye on questions as well, just in case anybody's asking anything. So let's have a little look at actually some of the rushes from this. I'm just going to flick through these, and oh, there's a good question. What is the advantage of using the 100mm and the 25mm to each other? So the 100mm lens really, for me, works more like a traditional macro lens in the sense that you could use it at any focal length, basically. So, and you could use it for a portrait shot. You could photograph something at infinity. You can use it very much like a normal kind of portrait style lens, but it also allows you such incredible close focus because it is a macro lens. So it's very familiar to most people if you're only getting into macro cinematography or photography for the first time. Something like a traditional 100mm lens works really well and it's quite accessible. The 25mm, because it's a magnification lens, works very differently and is very much a speciality kind of lens. What we're looking at right now, I think this is aspirin dissolving basically in a solution. And why I called this project Unseen is because to me these are things which you just don't see them. They are unseen elements unless you essentially have a way of magnifying what's going on in front of you. They're kind of the things that are happening in the world all the time around us, but they just pass us by because they're so absolutely minuscule and kind of unseen by the human eye. Again, this is kind of I kept some of these things in the film. This was kind of experimenting with paints at the beginning. My intent was to create something, and luckily the music really, I think, actually was the thing which made this, was to make something definitely abstract and quite kind of evocative of space, and it's just sort of a different world, not to really demonstrate, when you actually see the behind the scenes of what this was, which was essentially me filming some paint in a bottom of a glass, it's really unromantic. It's not very exciting at all. So the challenge was to create something which didn't feel like we definitely knew what it was, and let the music kind of take you somewhere in terms of the feeling. What's interesting there, you can actually see, you see my cursor, you can see the light that I'm using there and the reflection. So that was a bit of I don't know if we used that shot. Those are the sort of things I try and hide more days now, because to me that kind of breaks the illusion of the filmmaking. You're actually seeing inside, you're seeing behind the curtain a little bit too much. But there were some really kind of interesting textures in here. But then for me, where it got really interesting, and this was probably after about 3 or 4 hours of experimentation, we started experimenting with metallic paints, and it took a long time. These shots are really underexposed, and compared to how they end up in the final film, which again is a demonstration of how much raw photography, or cinematography in this case, can really save footage. But what's interesting is the technique I used here is I underlit the glass solution, so the light that's coming through here is coming through, this is being underlit from the metallic paint. And to me it started just to create these kind of interesting worlds, this interesting color palette and dynamic range. I was really interested with this idea of raw cinematography, raw workflow with ProRes RAW, that we should have this incredible sense of dynamic range, especially when these projects are finished in HDR. It's going to whiz through some more of this. You can see here, some of the raw rushes. The highlights are a bit all clipped and slightly strange there. But some of this just became really, really strange. And this again was sort of the combinations of the aspirin breaking up inside the solution of paint. It was quite messy. And then here's some of the water droplet sort of things. Most of this, from memory, was actually filmed, I think, with some of the 100mm lenses, because you don't need to necessarily be quite as close. I'm going to look through again. I'm just going to let this footage play through so you can watch a little bit more. I'm just going to stop the stream 1 minute and then restart it. So if anyone's watching live, please stay on the page. It's just going to restart in a couple of seconds. Hello, if you've had to restart your stream. Hopefully somebody is still there. What I'm going to do now is actually switch to looking at a little bit of a kind of a live demo of some of the footage that we were kind of looking at just then. So if we come across here, what I've got set up here is basically turn this light on, which is suddenly really bright. Here we go. I've got the Zcam 𝘼𝙗𝙢𝙬 set up with the 25mm magnification lens. And what I'm going to try and do is demonstrate what we're looking at the same time as sort of live switching. So looking at right now, just under lens for point of view of kind of context, I'll put it onto this camera here, is it's just basically, it's a coin. It's the only coin I could find. It is a Cuban coin, weirdly. And what we're going to do is put that under this camera here. And this is using the magnification lens. So you've seen what I was looking at in my hand. Now we're looking at it under this lens. And you can just start to see just how absolutely incredible the detail is. And right away, you can see the first problem that I kind of encountered. And something I kind of learned is that for stills, it's a single moment. But when it comes to cinematography, you want things to be moving. And the hardest point is that the amount of stabilization and vibration you're getting at any point whilst filming at such intense magnifications is without doubt the kind of the hardest thing to figure out to begin with. Because you can see here, all I'm doing at the moment, I'm changing the magnification, and just even my hand on the lens under that sort of magnification is even my hand on the table at that point. Just if I do that, just the tiniest amount of vibration starts to become an issue. So I guess what I learned from experimenting with these techniques is the best thing to do is not to try and actually move the camera, but it's actually better. I'll just try and get an interesting angle here, try and shoot across this a bit, get a little bit, you can see also the amount lighting becomes key here, but you can see what I'm using right now. I'm just literally using a little portable LED light, because the volume of light doesn't need to be particularly high. You just need to be able to control the intensity, because we're lighting such a small area. So as I start to light it up here, so as opposed to moving the camera, it's much better to just move the subject. So what I'm doing, if you can see there, is I'm just moving the coin with my fingertip. And of course this is about the most unsophisticated way you could do this. It's fair to say I'm deeply obsessed with images and what today's sensors and camera technology allows us to see. It's essential to me that the cameras we use now can not only allow us to capture a great image, but give maximum flexibility over that image in post-production. In the same way a photographer's image starts in camera and is finished in software, the exact same workflow happens when filming. And so being able to record in a RAW format is one of the main things I look for today to maintain control over the image from capture through to the grade. I've been filming with Z-cams since the first E2 MFT camera came out, but the most interesting camera for me is the E2 F6 due to its 6K full-frame sensor and wide dynamic range. Pairing this sensor with the ability to record ProRes RAW via an Atomos Ninja 5 makes this a really powerful combination. I'd not filmed with ProRes RAW yet, so I wanted to design a shoot to maximize the 6K resolution of the camera, paired with the flexibility and quality of the ProRes RAW format. I'm interested in macro photography, so wanted to try out some techniques often used when taking still images. I love small, light and easy to use equipment, as it's essential to me that the gear doesn't get in the way or slow down the creative process. I like to be able to stick a lens on a camera, battery on the back, power it up and start shooting within seconds. In the same way, it's important that the image workflow is also quick and easy. I love that the ProRes RAW files can immediately be imported into Final Cut 10, instantly edited and graded, without proxy workflows, transcoding or rendering. Today's computers allow us to work at full quality with the 6K ProRes RAW files from start to finish, so you're always seeing the maximum image quality and detail the entire time. I think this is amazing, as it allows us to make creative decisions over the look of the image at any stage. I grade as I edit, often setting looks initially via custom LUTs, and constantly tweaking and playing with the colours as I work. We shouldn't have to wait until the 11th hour of a project to start the grade. It should run in parallel with the edit. HDR is an essential part of any image workflow today. With this camera and recorder, I can monitor and record to ProRes RAW 2020 PQ and adopt this color space throughout the edit and grade. I don't have to wait until the end. I can see the HDR images from the camera as soon as I shoot them. Again, this just allows more creativity within post. The tools we have today are amazing. Cameras and recorders that are this small can be taken anywhere, and when you can finish everything on a laptop, the only limitations are your own imagination. I just thought I'd show that film again, as I was just sorting something audio-wise. Back to looking at trying to basically get something useful out of a coin underneath a macro lens like this. What I'm going to pull in now is actually a solution of paint. And just have a quick look at this. This is a little bit more akin to what I was filming with. So, try my technique of backlighting it a little bit. Still good, still audio. This to me is kind of where the experimentation really starts to kind of come into place, because once the table stops shaking, you can sense the kind of key thing is all about finding some little moment of something unseen, and just something that obviously you would not look for normally. And so I tend to look here, there we go, there's something happening. So I just mixed up a little bit of paint with some washing up liquid, and there's still movement and some alchemy going on there. And I'm hypnotized by this sort of thing. Watch it all day long, which is why obviously I thought to make a film about it. But you can see the technique really is kind of underwhelming, I find, compared to the actual end results, when you can, by happy accident or chance, get something kind of interesting just going on in front of the lens. Look, so this paint is still moving about. It's probably starting to react more now because I've got light underneath it. So the light is starting to heat up the paint. And like I said, it's just about, you just see the bit of oil there. So sort of filmed at 6K, and then you just wait for little moments of things to happen in front of the frame. And this is why aspirin is so useful as well, because throwing aspirin into it really starts to kind of create this reaction in the liquids in the paint. And what you're trying to do is you're trying to force incredibly small, tiny little moments and movements inside a solution. I'm just going to also answer a couple of questions as I see them coming in now. What do you use for camera movement? My original slider was an Edelchrome slider. I've been using that for years, but I've started also using Rhino sliders. And
let me ask this question. 𝘼𝙗𝙤𝙪 but handling the Laowa probe lens is difficult since it's very long and tends to jitter. So yeah, slider-wise, I'm now using a Rhino slider. In fact, that's what's filming this setup here. Basically, it's a Z-Cam E2 on top of a Rhino slider with an action sort of module. So it's doing this parallax at the same time. And for macro cinematography, I'd say it's quite key to be careful not to overdo the camera movement, simply because, as you can see from my example here, you know, the tiniest tapping like that creates incredibly unnatural amounts of movement, basically. So from a tip myself was to really not move the camera. I found it much better to actually just let the solutions move in front of me. Another question for these kinds of shots, should I under or overexpose it? I found filming in RAW invaluable for this because my rushes really suffered, basically. So you absolutely need to give things enough light. You either need to do a lot of experimentation and testing, or if you can pick a RAW codec, then it will just give you more latitude to sort of work from. How many flowers did you burn before I got the effect I wanted? Well, we filmed about 4 different sets of flowers in here until we got a bit concerned the smoke alarms were going off. And then at that point, we decided that was probably enough. And that was just because I really wanted to test at the end. I wanted to show the sense of dynamic range that you get both from using a RAW codec like ProRes RAW and also through HDR as well, which is just such a fantastic device for showing incredible color tonality. We're nearly at an hour, so I'm going to start to wrap things up. And just at the end, I think what I'd like to do, importantly, I'd like to do a shout out to say in a fortnight's time, if I can find my slide at the right point, in a fortnight's time, a